Okay, I think we can start. The event is free and the link is accessible, so if others are joining later, they can simply come in. So you can hear properly, yeah? Everything is fine, we are recording. So the event will also be up later on. Okay. Will be available later on. We will upload it on our website. So welcome everybody to this GERPISA monthly seminar. I see the participants, most of you should be already familiar with GERPISA and with our activities. If you are not, please be aware that GERPISA not only has a website, but is present on all social media. So if you are tweeting today or you want to check later on, you want to follow us for our events and for our monthly colloquium, we are on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The website also has an archive of publications on the automotive industry that you can access if you subscribe as a member of the network. It's very easy. You can do it from the website. We will have an annual colloquium in June that is also advertised on the website. You can join if you want. Yes, Sebastian is sharing all this information in the chat. Our colloquium will be online, so virtual, from the 14th to the 18th of June this year. So this is our monthly seminar, but for this month we will have a last seminar also on the 21st of May, which will be on the future of work and will be in French. You know that we have some events in French and some in English. Today, this one will be in English.
Just a point, in French and in German.
I do know.
Translation in German.
Thank you. Today, please join me in welcoming Giulia Teresa Eder, that will talk to us, will share with us her work on progressive industrial policy for Europe, challenges and prospects for the European automotive sector. Giulia is, please correct me if I make mistakes, but Giulia is currently a PhD candidate in sociology at the Johannes Kepler University Linz, where she's also been lecturing and working as a research associate. But I don't know if you already joined or you will be joining as a lecturer the University of Applied Sciences in Vienna this year. Giulia's research broadly deals with the political economy of regional integration and has a special focus on opportunities and limits of industrial development and the role, she's exploring the role of joint industrial policy. The presentation today will build on a paper titled Progressive Industrial Policy, a Remedy for Europe, that she wrote in 2018 together with her colleague Etienne Schneider. In the paper, Giulia and Etienne question the idea and engage with the debate on what is progressive industrial policy. And of course, we will, Giulia will explain better, but they engage and propose the idea that for a progressive industrial policy to exist, it is important, it is crucial to engage with three issues. On the one hand, power relations and hegemony that needs to be taken into account for our progressive industrial policy. Secondly, it is necessary to engage with cross-cutting issues, including ecological sustainability, labor and democratic participation, and gender sensitivity, not only used to be not only used as buzzwords in the debate, but substantiated in practice. And thirdly, they propose to engage and to take into account the issue of core periphery amongst European countries. So this paper was focused on industrial policy for Europe. Julia will relate it for us to the case of the automotive industry. And I'm sure, building on our presentation, we will also try to make sense of what this means in the light of the current COVID crisis, where the importance of manufacturing emerged significantly, not only for the emergency period, but also for reconstruction afterwards. So this is a I'm sure this is a very interesting topic that I'm sure will trigger an important discussion. What we generally do is we have up to 1 hour of presentation, then we have a short break. Then Tommaso will launch the discussion with some comments and also some open questions that can be followed by an open debate afterwards. We have 3 hours available. Generally, Julia, for your information, we use all of them because we always receive many questions. But again, everybody, we will see. Everybody is invited, encouraged to participate. I'm sure they will do. I will leave it here. You can also share the screen, right?
Yes.
So, okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hello from my side. I'm Julia Eder, and I will share my screen now so that you can see the slides of my presentation. I will try not to speak 1 hour, but rather like 45 minutes, because 1 hour is very long, I think. But I think it will take the 45 minutes exactly because of what Lorenza mentioned, that I will try to link what we say in this paper to debates on the automotive industry and also to the most current debates on COVID-19 recovery, which also play a crucial role, I think, in our topic. So I will start by explaining you a bit what I will tell you. So what is to expect by myself? First, I will talk about the main challenges that industrial policy making faces currently, or probably rather during the past decade. And then I will talk about the comeback of industrial policy that is related exactly to those challenges. Then I will shortly explain what industrial policy is and how progressive industrial policy diverges from mainstream industrial policy approaches. Then I will come to the specifications and supplements that we introduce in our paper to the debate on progressive industrial policy, which is, as has already been mentioned, on the politics of industrial policy, on some cross-cutting issues, and on the question of uneven and dependent industrial development in Europe that we consider crucial for recovery, but also for reducing the imbalances existing in the European economic structure currently. And then lastly, some conclusions. I have meanwhile written a brochure on the European automotive industry for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. So I will also draw on some insights stemming from this brochure, but when I do that, I will mention it explicitly so that it's clear when I talk about the common paper and when I talk about the brochure. That is not out yet, so it's not possible to read it yet. So what are the main challenges that we face with respect to industrial development and industrial policy making? So on the one hand, there has been several crises, which I will talk about in a minute. Then we have the challenge of decarbonization, of the ecological transition of the industrial sector, of digitalization, of the digitalization of industrial production processes, but also of industrial products like autonomous driving, for example, in the case of cars. We have the experience of catching up economies in East Asia that rose the question whether industrial policy was an important factor in making this rise possible in the beginning. And we have geopolitical factors that I will also mention in a minute more in detail. So all those 5 factors have led to the comeback of industrial policy. That's at least what I would argue, and that Etienne and I have argued in a more recent paper that we've written together, but that one is in German, so it's not really accessible to many of you, I guess. But if anyone is interested, I can post a link into the chat later on. So that's the factors that we see as influencing this comeback of industrial policy. The crisis, on the one hand, was the global financial crisis of the year 2008 and the following years, but also now the COVID-19 crisis that have basically led to a re-legitimization of state interventions that, particularly during the neoliberal decades beforehand, were not seen as a legitimate way of restructuring the economy or of intervening in the economy. At the same time, it has also become clear that less financialized economies having a sound industrial base have come better through the crisis. They have recovered quicker. So the resilience is bigger if you're not relying on financialized growth models. And this is also some factor that has been debated after the global financial crisis, but that also now in the COVID-19 recovery, we will see, I guess. That's my opinion on it. And also the global financial crisis has shown the huge imbalances existing in the Eurozone. And I think that also COVID-19 will increase the polarization in Europe if there is no policy response working concretely against the increase of polarization. Then, with respect to decarbonization, we saw in Germany the German energy transition, but also in other countries, we had programs on a national scale to invest in green industrial policy, and also more recently on the European level, decarbonization and also digitalization have become the crucial pillars of industrial policy. In the case of digitalization, we talk about Industry 4.0, about artificial intelligence, and as I mentioned before, about topics like autonomous driving, and also about communicating machines that are learning. So we have a very new approach to technology. We have a new stage of technological progress there. The catch-up successes of East and Southeast Asian states, I have already mentioned, but they have also a geopolitical component. The rise of Asia, or the Asian age, as it's called in development studies. And this has also influenced the EU debate. But first, because that's going far more back, is this debate on industrial policy. Why do you need it, particularly now? This is the outcome of the crisis, of the global financial crisis. So actually the European Commission starts new industrial policy strategies between 2010 and 2017. There were 3 new documents released on that question. And then we also see that these geopolitical circumstances change. So in 2016, Trump comes to power and he starts his America First program. And this causes already a geopolitical shift. And together with the increased competition with China, this comes in as a very important factor in the redesign of EU industrial policy, I would argue at least. And it leads in 2019 to the publication of the German-French Manifesto for a European Industrial Policy that led or proposes for the first time to deviate from the very strict competition rules that are in place in the European Union. It raises the question whether it might be a good idea to allow for the creation of European champions by relaxing those competition rules. And it's a huge change, because before that, leveling the playing field was the most important idea behind industrial policy in the European Union, which officially still is. But as I said, there are debates surging that this might not be the best orientation if you want to be able to compete on a global scale with China and with US companies. So there's a link between the rise of China and the German-French Manifesto. And then the next program is the European Green Deal that obviously tries to deal with this decarbonization challenge that I've mentioned before, and the EU Industrial Strategy that was published in March 2020 and updated last week. So we have now quite a lot of industrial policy documents that have as a main idea, you need to decarbonize, you need to take into account the digital transition, but at the same time, there's this geopolitical context that has become more relevant in comparison to earlier decades. So that's the broad context. And all of that is actually directed towards maintaining competitiveness where it's already established, or to increase competitiveness where it has been lost, particularly compared to US or Chinese companies, for example, in the digital economy, platform economies. But before we come to the real issue of my presentation, I think I shortly need to clarify what industrial policy actually is. So we have general industrial policy measures, also called horizontal measures, that aim at framework conditions, and selective vertical measures that tackle specific sectors. So framework conditions can be research and development funding or tax incentive, export subsidies, but not directed to specific sector or specific companies, but available to all economic actors in a defined economy. In the case of selective or vertical industrial policy, you can have strategic industrial policy that has a vision and is oriented towards the future, like the German energy transition, or reactive industrial policy that deals with sectors that already exist and that might need to be reduced or phased out in the case of unsustainable industries. And selective industrial policy can also target specific missions. For example, it can set the objective to fight the climate change. It can set the goal to focus on a sector like high tech, or it can be directed towards specific technologies like artificial intelligence or electromobility. So that would be the broad idea. And the main reason why I've shown you this is the European Union had its main bias on the left-hand side. So it mainly relied on horizontal industrial policy for quite a long period. And then now this most recent debate that I've mentioned before shows that there might be a shift to some selective industrial policies around those European champions in order to be able to compete with China and the US in specific fields. Yes. Then what is progressive industrial policy? I've shown you before that there was a comeback of industrial policy very generally, but also left-wing actors and progressive actors have started to debate quite a lot on industrial policy making. So critical scholars and left-wing organizations started to write about alternative or progressive industrial policy. or the rebuilding of productive capacities in the EU. For example, Transform Europe, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Euromemo. So there has been quite a lot of publications in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. They presented industrial policy as a tool against austerity-driven crisis management, so as an alternative to austerity and structural reforms as they were promoted by the European Commission, and also stated that a goal should be to decrease the imbalances within the EU and the Eurozone. The key components of those proposals were to establish an EU-wide investment plan to increase demand and stimulate investment, financed by EU institutions such as the European Investment Bank. And I have to say that this specific measure does not deviate that much from the Juncker plan as it has come in the end. But they also argued for a strong role of the state, for example, for public investments in research and development, for the strengthening of state-owned enterprises, and for the strategic use of public procurement. And this back then has been more radical as a claim that you wanted to adopt for your policies. But I would argue that by now also the stronger role of the state has moved towards the center of the proposals, towards the mainstream proposals, due to this kind of geopolitical competition that I've mentioned before, that has brought this concern to the fore that you might lose out on other countries not using the state's power strategically. But if this is the case and those two components are actually maybe already quite common in industrial policy making, what is then actually progressive about progressive industrial policy? And that's what we try to answer in our paper, and that's where I will come to now. We have adopted this decalogue for industrial policy by Mario Pianta, Matteo Lucchese, and Leopoldo Nassia that was included in a brochure for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation on what is to be produced, the making of a new industrial policy for Europe. And they argue in this context that there should be three major goals of industrial policy making in the EU. To ensure environmental sustainability, to develop appropriate ICT applications, and to have health, welfare, and caring as very important sectors of industrial policy interventions. And I find now that the third field is particularly interesting as this has been written in 2016, so before COVID-19. And I think nowadays it's easier to communicate why the third point is crucial also for industrial policy interventions. But they say in their decalogue for industrial policy that it's important to ensure static efficiency and dynamic efficiency, which would be quite typical for industrial policy in general. And they argue in favor of the design of appropriate technologies and ecological sustainability. And I would argue that those 4 points have somehow entered the mainstream debates. On the left, static efficiency and dynamic efficiency have always been part of industrial policy debates, also of the mainstream. But this kind of strategically using technologies, particularly to ensure ecological sustainability, this has also become a quite well-spread idea, I would argue. But then they also have 6 other points that deviate more from the mainstream perspective. So they argue that industrial policy should focus on democracy and economic democracy and power diffusion. So they raise the question, how can workers' participation or also participation of the broader society become a part of industrial policy making? They argue in favor of the restriction of the financial sector. And that disarmament would be a crucial component of progressive industrial policy, which currently is obviously not a shared concern by the European Union, as we can see looking at PESCO and related programs. They also argued that there should be a focus on employment and employment creation, and on the fair distribution of the benefits that stem from the industrial sector, as well as the attempt to balance unequal regional development in the European Union. And we felt, reading this paper, Etienne and I, that this was a really good point, or these were really good points, but that some things were actually missing. So we felt that this concept neglects the question of hegemony and the balance of forces. It does not specify the treatment of cross-cutting issues such as sustainability, decent work, gender sensitivity. Those issues are mentioned, but it's not specified what this would actually mean in an industrial policy context. And it's not that easy, as I will outline a bit later. And it does not reflect sufficiently on the nature of inner European dependency or core-periphery relations. So this is where we start, and we added the dimension of politics to industrial policy. We started to fill some of the buzzwords that were used with concrete content, and we started to bring in considerations and experiences from catch-up development debates stemming from the Global South, because we felt that that might be useful to enrich the debate on how to cope with core-periphery relations in Europe. So the politics of industrial policy are totally crucial, according to us, because in order to implement industrial policy, you have to have in mind that they are not implemented in a societal vacuum, but that there exist power relations, different interests, and it's very important to understand the social relation of forces in order to be able to design industrial policy that is implementable and that also finally establishes an alliance that is strong enough to really implement that one. So to start the analysis, it's good to have an idea about the production system and about the fractionization of capital and labor that is linked to this production system and its sectoral composition. To give you an idea what we mean by that, we have, for example, brown energy industry, we have the automotive industry, renewable energy industry, several other industries in a country, and the financial sector. So we have a production system that is composed by different industries and other sectors. And we also have a fractionalization of labor according to those sectors. As you all know that have worked on trade unions at some point, trade unions are in many cases organized according to sectors. So they're not all working together, but organized separately. And this has also some consequences for the interests that might be related to specific workers in an industry. This production system is what industrial policy seeks to transform or to stimulate. And most likely, industrial policy will stimulate some industries, some sectors more than others. And this creates necessarily winners and losers. And this is also what industrial policy making, why industrial policy making is a delicate field, because the resources are limited. So by deciding who will get money, you already favor some actors over others, maybe in some cases only indirectly, but I could talk about that later in the debate if it's interesting for someone what I mean by that, because horizontal industrial policy officially does not discriminate any actor. So industrial policy is usually implemented by the state, which we see not as one monolithic unit, but as a material condensation of forces. What does this mean? This means that different societal interests are present in the state and its state apparatuses, and that even the state might not have one congruent opinion what industrial policy should look like, but it's a contested field. And you have also political parties like A and B that try to influence the state in this. And the state has what is called in the theory strategic selectivity. So it takes into account some interests more than others, which is related to power relations, as I have mentioned before. And there is different interest groups that try to influence the state or specific political parties to implement policy in their favor. And also trade unions and NGOs and social movements try to do this to some extent, although they have more limited resources in some cases, particularly NGOs and social movements. And what is now the question, if we talk about progressive industrial policy, the question is, how can you build an alliance between strong and also critical societal actors that is also congruent and that will maintain some conflicts and debates about the question what good industrial policy should look like. And it's also a crucial task to find those parts of the state apparatus that you might be able to influence in a positive way and get on your side for implementing industrial policy according to your own interests and needs. And lastly, it's also important to have in mind that ultimately you need to receive hegemonic support for alternative development models. So it's not really realistic to have a very radical industrial policy proposal and to not care about how you might engage the population with this proposal and how you can gain support by the population of this proposal. And all what I've said up to now was limited to the national level. And now we have to come back to our topic and think that in the European Union, we have in total 27 states where each of those states has this production system that is fractionized and that is inserted in a specific way in the International Division of Labor, where very different interests are present. And so it becomes even more difficult to establish such a coalition, such a social alliance around progressive industrial policy, because so many interests are present and some interests can be pushed easier at the transnational level than others. The transnational capital has a better stance to organize its interest on the higher level than trade unions, for example. For the social ecological transformation of the automotive industry, and this is now from the brochure that I wrote for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, I would argue that you would need to build a specific coalition between different trade union bodies, political parties, think tanks, research projects and expert groups, but also NGOs and social movements. So the task would be to think who are the actors, who are the social groups that might be interested in a social ecological transformation and that might be able to contribute for one reason or another. And then bring them together, let them debate and find a solution together. I personally think it's not the best thing to do to establish industrial policy from the top to the bottom and not to care for the population, for other actors that are not enterprises or trade unions, particularly because the whole population has to bear the consequences of industrial policy, so they should at least have the possibility to express their views in such a debate. I can show this slide later when we are debating, and I will move on now to the cross-cutting issues. So the first one is the social ecological transformation. And there we have currently I would say, competing visions of what this transformation or transition should look like. Green industrial policy has been adopted at the European Union level recently quite a lot. So the aim to establish a green economy, green capitalism, and bioeconomy has become part of the European Union document mainstream, because those fields are seen as new ways of investing and growing. So it's actually quite related to a growth imperative. And also there exists this idea that by adopting green industrial policy, the European Union can establish a green competitive advantage on a world scale that will ultimately help in those geopolitical struggle that I've mentioned before. And this vision is mainly oriented towards technology and innovation. So the idea is that as long as there's lots of innovation, material and energy efficiency will increase enough in order to solve the ecological crisis that we are facing. And this whole shift to electric mobility is part of this new vision of a green transition. However, there's also more radical proposals around social ecological transformation, and they argue that not only the promotion of new industries and innovation are crucial for the greening of the economy, but also the disruption of existing pathways of industrial production and consumption, the conversion of brown industries. And I would say here, brown industries are not only energy intensive industries as the European Union frames them currently, but also we would need to debate about the automotive industry, because by transport emissions, by causing transport emissions, it has also quite important effects on CO2 emissions. So I think it's not possible to talk about brown industries without talking about the automotive industry. And a more radical proposal would also be structure oriented. That means that also transport and settlement patterns will be questioned. And this means, for example, to question disorganization of global production in global value chains, and also the settlement patterns, for example, that people have their small house distributed all around the country, as it's quite common in Austria. And then you need a car because in your small village, there is no public transport actually going frequently. So this is actually linked to this problem of specific production patterns. And then it would also be important to transform and reconstruct industrial policy institutions, because many of them have been dismantled during the neoliberal restructuring. And now in many states, there are no proper institutions that could design and implement such industrial policies. And for this kind of transformation, you would need to include the workers, to retrain and redeploy them, to not leave them behind. This leads me to the next question, and that is the role of trade unions and labor issues. Labor organizations would need to become the mediating organizations between progressive industrial policy and high labor standards. Trade unions originated in manufacturing sectors and they are still anchored there. So that's why I think they need to become crucial actors of any kind of progressive industrial policy. Although, and this is a pity, I think, the role of employment in industrial policy is quite often neglected. So in many cases, only the enterprises appear, but not the workers themselves. However, I think that during the past years, particularly the past 3 years, the trade union bodies at the European Union level, but also national trade union bodies, have recognized a lot the importance of industrial policy to shape structural change. And there has been quite a lot of publications on that topic recently. So I think this is changing now. And trade unions become more interested in industrial policy making again. But there are also major challenges related to this question. So there's a tension between job preservation and the transformation of industries. Obviously, because if everything stays the same, in many cases, jobs will remain. If there is a transformation or even a phase out, jobs will be reduced. And that's something that you will not want to propose as a trade union if there is no alternative option that you can propose your own members. A second challenge is that the role of trade unions in industrial policy decision-making needs to be balanced. And there is a huge problem, this locational competition, competitiveness discourse versus transnational solidarity, solidarity with other production sites in other EU countries, which is particularly relevant as we have global value chains spanning across several countries. In many cases, also in the automotive industry, and to focus very much on the own production side automatically leads to the establishment of competition or to the adoption of the competition narrative to be against the other production sites or to need to compete with other production sites and therefore adopt some cooperative strategies that might not be the best strategies in the long term if we talk about severe restructuring of the economy due to sustainable or sustainability issues. Another cross-cutting issue are gender relations, and they're debated quite scarcely in industrial policy making, but I felt it was actually quite interesting to have a look into that. The gender dimension does not play a role in the design or in the evaluation of industrial policy, but you can make the argument from a sociological point of view that the impact of industrial policy measures might be different on male and female workers for different reasons. On the one hand, there is a gender-specific segregation among employers. So if you decide to focus with industrial policy measures on manufacturing sector enterprises, you will most likely subsidize companies owned by men. It's like about, it's a very high percentage that it's owned by men. I think it's more than 80%. And then you also have a gender-specific segregation of the labor market, so on the workers' side. As you all know, women tend to work in the service sector, and men work or tend to work in manufacturing sector. So it's like 3/4 of the people working in manufacturing are male. And also inside the manufacturing industries, you have a segregation. On the one hand, you have a horizontal segregation. So women tend to work in the labor-intensive sectors, while men tend to work in the technology-intensive, capital-intensive sectors. And also in the female-dominated manufacturing sectors, you have vertical segregation. So the top positions in those sectors, in many cases, are held by men. So in this, this is what in general you could say about the segregation of the labor market from that perspective. And what does this mean for industrial policy making? It means obviously that industrial trade unions have also mainly male members, and this leads also, I think, a bit to the neglect of this topic at all. But why I think it's important is the following. Industrial policy focuses in many cases on the technologically most advanced sectors. And those are the sectors where the male people working there are quite high. So the share of male manufacturing workers is particularly high in the technologically most advanced sectors. So indirectly, you're subsidizing those manufacturing sectors where more men work and less women. Why is this? So this is one thing that you have to have in mind. The second is that it has also been shown by research on the Global South that technological upgrading in labor-intensive manufacturing leads to defeminization. So the share of female workers was reduced. So even if you say, okay, I focus on labor-intensive manufacturing sectors with my industrial policy measures, you could cause defeminization because technological upgrading led to the increased employment of men in those sectors. And I think this is highly relevant thinking about Industry 4.0 and the digitalization of industry. What will this might cause in this share of female employment in the manufacturing sector? On the other hand, if you say that feminization of sectors would be a solution, this is also not true. So it would be, in my opinion, insufficient to argue that the goal has to be that the share of women needs to increase, definitely. One reason is because the feminization of sectors, so the increase of the female share of workers, has usually the effect that wages get lower and the sector loses prestige. So this cannot be the goal. But what I think what would be really important is to have a gender impact assessment before implementing industrial policy measures. So to have a look at everything that I said now, to look at the numbers and to look at the dynamics of male and female workers, and then to consider whether you might have some indirect discrimination of female workers by implementing that kind of industrial policy measure. Yeah, and now I come to the last bigger point, that's how to tackle uneven and dependent industrial development in Europe. So there have been quite a lot of debates about the re-regulation of external economic relations of the European Union, for example, restrictions of Chinese FDI, and about the reshoring of industrial production, for example, concerning electric mobility, but also with respect to medical goods, for example. But the focus has usually been on the global division of labor. So the argument is you have to get it back to Europe, or you have to protect Europe, but not on the inner European division of labor. And Etienne and I argue in this paper that it's actually crucial to also have the inner European division of labor in mind. Why? Because if the objective is to overcome the imbalances in the European Union, you also have to have a look at how the division of labor works. I will show that more in detail on the next slide. And to this is connected the following issues. So there have been 3 phases of the deindustrialization of Southern Europe that are actually connected to how the European integration process works. The first was the establishment of the single market at the beginning of the 1990s, when Southern European industries could not compete with products from the northern core countries. We have the introduction of the euro that took those countries the possibility to devaluate and gain industrial competitiveness through this measure. And the Eurozone crisis and austerity policies, and probably, or I hope not, but there could be a 4th phase now, starting with COVID-19 and the uneven recovery that is to be expected from that crisis. So what is this hierarchical division of labor in Europe that I've mentioned before? Actually, there are coexisting different regimes of accumulation in Europe, and they are, as stated here, a contradictory ensemble. So they fit, but there are contradictions linked to them. We have Germany at the core and other countries such as the Netherlands, Austria, and Northern Italy. They are focused on productive accumulation. They have strong industrial sectors, and they are export-led. So they focus on active extraversion. They have a trade surplus usually, and they export capital to other countries in the European Union and outside, but mostly inside to the Southern European countries and the Eastern European countries. That's the core, and to the core we have the Visegrad states that are linked to them and are quite closely integrated into value chains that span to Germany or to Austria, and that have also this kind of productive accumulation because they are focused on manufacturing, and the automotive industry plays actually the crucial role in this. So that's the most important value chains spanning between the Visegrad states and Germany and Austria. And then we have the Southern European periphery. We have Spain and Portugal, Greece, and Southern Italy. And they are characterized by a very different growth model, but a growth model that is linked to the first one. So they are characterized by financialization, by weak industrial capacities, at least in many sectors. I know that Spain has a quite strong automotive industry, and also Portugal has industries, but generally speaking, industrial capacities are weaker. And they are characterized by passive extroversion. That means that they have an external dependence of good imports, so they have a trade deficit, and they are dependent on capital import, which they receive from the core countries. So there is this dependency relation between those two, and then France is in between. Because France is by now, I would say, subordinated to Germany, at least in some fields. I think this is probably debatable, and I'm really curious to hear what you are saying about this. And then, obviously, France is a dominant actor when it comes to these southern peripheries, where it is acting as a core. However, it's also important to not only focus on the division of labor inside Europe, because the deficits of the periphery are not merely the downside of Europe, of the German or core surpluses, because the Eurozone is not a self-contained entity. So countries like China play a role, and also the US, for example. So for the Southern European countries, it was difficult to compete with Chinese products also in some sectors, and this also played a role in this whole deindustrialization process. So it would be wrong to only focus on the EU. And what to do about this now? So I would argue that the reconstruction of industrial capacities in Southern Europe would be necessary in order to reduce uneven development in Europe. And that's a very difficult task, and even more difficult now with COVID-19. Even if the fiscal policy restrictions have been lifted by now, simply as a nation state, the Southern European countries have less money available than countries of the European core, such as Austria and Germany, and they have less leeway to implement industrial policies than the core countries, just for those financial issues. And also the single market is part of the problem, because we have those quite strict competition rules that do restrict state aid. They have been lifted now due to COVID, but still the question is, how long will this be in place? And what happens if we return to a single market where leveling the playing field becomes the rule again? Because then it will be hard again for those smaller countries to take measures. When we wrote this paper, Etienne and I asked ourselves, what is the appropriate degree of European or international market integration for the periphery? What kind of relations do you need to have? And is deepening the European integration the solution, or might it be a better way to strive for selective re-regulation and selective delinking? And linked to this are two different policy proposals. So the option one would be to increase the integration inside the EU and to establish a transfer union that is financed by the core countries and that establishes frequent and stable financial flows to the southern periphery that it needs in order to maintain its growth model, its debt-led growth model. Option two would be to consider something completely different, and that's what I mean by selective delinking. It would mean to ask the question, might it be an option to find or define exceptions of the single market rules so-called pockets of protectionism. That's what they name them what we name them in the paper, and to say that the weaker economies, particularly of Southern Europe, but also of Eastern Europe in some cases, are entitled to define some sectors where they can apply some kind of protectionist barriers, but only for a period and only very few sectors, in order to reconstruct industrial capacities in their countries. There's lots of problems also connected to this proposal, but I have debated on it controversially quite a lot. So I'm just looking forward to hear what you're saying on that. And in order to have this work, it would probably also be a good idea to strengthen the cooperation among the European peripheral economies. Where does this proposal come from? It's actually something that we adopted by looking at debates in the Global South on dependency and on self-reliance, where they proposed in the 1970s and 80s that it might be a good idea to strive for selective delinking from dominant production systems through import substitution, and to strive for the reintegration into alternative forms of industrial cooperation, because they said it's not possible to restructure the uneven division of labor while you remain completely inserted the same way as you did before. So you need to change something about your own insertion, and you do this by delinking. And they say this is indispensable for the productive reconstruction, which effectively challenges uneven development and the asymmetric industrial division of labor. So that's what we adopted and what we found that might be interesting for the debate. And this kind of selective protectionism, and also temporarily restricted, I would say, has clear disadvantages, as mentioned, but also the transfer union, that is the other option if you want to have more balanced development in Europe, would need to be supported by a progressive alliance in the core countries, in Germany, in Austria, in the Netherlands, in Sweden. And I don't see that right now, this kind of alliance or strong social movement that would say we would like to constantly support the Southern European countries with our money flows. And it also raises the question, from my point of view, what kind of development would that be? Because it would be still very dependent development, just relying on this kind of financial flows. And it would not mean that you have a sound economic basis on your own because you rely on that kind of transfers. But particularly the main reason why it will not come, I think, is this kind of progressive alliance that is not in place currently. And I think it's more likely, also now in the COVID-19 context, in my view, that in some member states, progressive alliances will surge, and that they will use the scope for progressive industrial policy measures. And they might even be able to push on the EU level for a shift, or maybe for a prolongation of the reforms that have been made now in this COVID-19 context, such as relaxing the fiscal policy restrictions. And also in that case, it would be important that as the progressive actors in the core countries, that they provide support to those movements, to those governments. But it would be necessary to a lower degree than in the case of a transfer union, because without any money flowing, it's just easier to sell, I would say, to your own population. So I think the implementation of progressive industrial policy at the EU level in the short and medium run is rather unlikely, although I think it's hardly predictable what will happen now in the COVID-19 context. And I think there might still be the option to have that kind of progressive industrial policy as an outcome of increasing contradictions due to COVID-19. I will leave it here because I'm curious to debate with you. And just to remember you, lastly, what I've told you, I will jump over one slide because I would rather show you this in the debate, I think. And I just want to remind you what I was talking about. You have to take into account relation of forces between class fractions and how they can be shifted, how you can also forge different interests into a compromise that lasts over time. Then I will mention that industrial policy should not only focus on economic growth, but you should consider cross-cutting issues such as social ecological transformation, decent work and gender sensitivity, and that industrial policy should also seek to challenge the hierarchical international or European division of labor. And it should try to analyze how is this kind of dependency linked to the economic structure and to the way exchange is organized between different countries, and what role does path dependency play, and how I can change the trajectory, the development trajectory of currently disadvantaged countries. I will leave it here, and I'm curious to hear your comments in the debate later on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Julia. I think probably after you can show this slide again and we can take it from your conclusions. We can now have a 10 minutes break. So we reconvene at 1:15, and then we will open the discussion, launching it with Tommaso's comments. See you in 10 minutes.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Lorenza, and thank you very much, Julia. That was an excellent presentation. I really liked your paper. We met at Rosa Luxemburg workshop, and later you sent me this article, and I thought that it would have been a great idea for GERPISA to have you on this topic inside at the core of our agenda. I think everything you've been talking about is extremely important. In particular for the automotive sector, I think is important, is far beyond the automotive sector. But when we think about the role that the automotive sector has in all the dimensions you've been talking about, because it is at the core of the green transitions, and clearly the transport sector is becoming the most net contributor to CO2 in Europe. So this is a clear, enormous challenge, and is perhaps one of the sectors that is most affected by European policies recently due to the combination of the Dieselgate and of the CO2 targets. So we see electrification coming very fast, and this so industrial policy is at the core of these transformations. It is at the core of regional imbalances. The development of the automotive industry during the last 20 years is all about that. We had huge new industries that have been created in Central and Eastern European countries, but also outside Europe in the custom zone. So we have fast growing cluster of production in Morocco. Turkey has always been an important player. And we know that this custom zone is an intermediate place where countries go through before getting integrated in the European Union. And we see that Ukraine is also becoming part of that. So this project of creating a value chain, European value chain with strong integration of peripheral countries as low-cost producers is keep going on. And the automotive industry is a perfect example of the effects of that, since Italy has lost almost 2/3 of its production during the 20 years. France has lost half of its productions. Spain is still competing, but its labor cost is going down rather than going up. So we all see these problems of regional imbalances. And this is a sector where you have strong trade union presence and relatively good wages. So the fact that even where you have strong union presence, strong institutional bargaining, yet the left has been incapable of steering the trajectory of this sector in any other direction than this rather neoliberal configuration. So that always also points out to the fact that the left has been extremely inefficient in challenging this evolution that we definitely need from a left point of view, but I say from a progressive point of view. There is a need for trade unions to re-kick themselves with tools, strategies, visions in order to think about these transformations. So for all these reasons, really, that's something that we really thank you very much to provide this rich overview. Also, the paper is very rich in terms of the literature that you need to know in order to understand this debate about industrial policy. So that is a very useful article. Now, the first point I would like to I have 4 points, and I will go of discussion. The first one is about this discussion about industrial policies and its revival in Europe. I think the paper makes a good, it points out rightly about the fact that the financial crisis and also the COVID crisis now in your presentation brings back industrial policy at the core of the debate. Yet I would say that there is a kind of view at the European level, but also in the main European country, that is not really a progressive industrial policy that is back, and that we're rather looking at the sort of neoliberal industrial policies, which is very similar to what the United States do, which is we need to deal with market failure. So whenever there is a market failure, whenever the market is not able to provide the right solutions, we need to recognize them, and then the states needs to intervene in order to solve this market failure. So this is particularly being extremely prominent in the development of new technology or in the green transition. So the mainstream industrial policies discussion at the European level are rather focused again on kind of US model. And I think this is very problematic. So while I understand that we need to stress what can be a progressive policy, I think there is also a need to deconstruct these mainstream vision of industrial policies that still exist as just a kind of mild intervention whenever markets do not work. And I guess we need to challenge the desirability of such a mild industrial policy, but also its efficiency and the fact that it doesn't work. And so I think part of the capacity to promote a progressive industrial policy comes also through the capacity of deconstruct this mainstream neoliberal industrial policy that is still dominant right now, at least at the European level. And I think for these sectoral analyses are very good, because it allows to brings down the debate to something that is very strongly empirical based, where we can clearly identify the problem and the issue. So I think that, again, the automotive sector can be a good place to start to deconstruct what has been the de facto industrial policy of the European Union so far, and why it's been so inefficient in promoting balanced development, greening, and efficiency. There is the other country that can be a model right now in the world is China. But China is a difficult model to take because it's a not democratic country, and so it's very difficult for any progressive researcher to take China as a model. Yet there are some examples. For example, Bill Lazonik, who's been working on financialization, has stressed how Chinese emerging multinational companies have been developing very fast because they are not financialized. Finance play a very small role in the China capitalist development. So that allows this company to reinvest massively whatever profits they generate. They are not tied to any finance-based targets. And so there is some literature that also looks at China as a possible counter-example to think about alternatives to the US model of neoliberal industrial policy. The second point I would like to talk is about the feasibility. And this is what I really like about your article is that, well, you cannot talk in the sky, you need to bring down to the ground. You can think about very desirable industrial policies, but if there are no rooms to make them happen, it becomes very difficult to see their interest to be involved in such a debate. And I think that we need to admit that there is a chicken egg problem here, in the sense that left forces have been weakened during the last 20, 30, 40 years of neoliberal transformation. So the power relations are all against whenever actors wants to bring progressive industrial policy on the ground. So, and also there is a problem that you don't really talk about, which in the paper, by which I think it should be also put at the core of the agenda, which is the cultural hegemony of the neoliberal view. So people can say, well, this is desirable, but it will never work. It's not efficient. There is a sort of baseline view that the tools of based on market competition or rules the world, and you cannot escape that. So there is a kind of Gramscian problems of cultural hegemony and the fact that power relationships are structured in a way in which trade unions, left parties, ONG are on the weak side of the power relation. So that needs to be addressed in terms perhaps of a lever. So the weight of the left forces are not so heavy in comparison to the capital forces or to the financial kind of based dogmatic view of the economy. So we need the lever to try to use the little weight we have to lift more than we can. And so this takes the problem of how you challenge this cultural hegemony. And this is an open question, but I think we need to put on the table of the fact that there is a strong cultural hegemony of, despite the revival of industrial policies of the neoliberal conception of capitalism. The third point I would like to touch upon is what I really like in your paper is this focus on the regional imbalances within the European Union, because this is perhaps clearly one of the road through which the power balances can change. And we've seen that the left has been extremely, I would say, has so far lost the struggle to capture the discontent arising from these countries and from the population affected in these countries. So we've seen in all these countries affected by these regional imbalances in development, rather populist as extreme right parties gaining more grounds. And this is particularly evident in the blue collar votes. Workers who are in the manufacturing sector massively vote in France for the extreme right parties. And the left has been extremely not efficient in capturing these votes. So this is another problem, which is that how do you represent this discontent and how do you channel towards the progressive industrial policies against the more populist or extreme right view of alternatives, which most of the time are nationalist kind of approach in which you get out of Europe and which of course are also not feasible, but this is the kind of struggle that we see on the political ground. And I think that it is important, and again, I think I hear about the automotive sector to clearly emphasize and make it clear the role that the European Union has had in creating these imbalances. That we had in the last 20 years a de facto industrial policy which clearly favor the core countries. For example, the single market could have been looked at as a resource to create development and reduce regional imbalance, and has been actually developed in order to integrate more and more lower cost countries and in order to be more open, as much as open as possible, towards the global economy. And if you look at the automotive sector, and if you look at, for example, at the exports in the automotive sector outside the European Union, and we take away the UK, which is now not part anymore of the European Union, well, 95% of the positive trade balance of the European Union with other countries outside in the world, but 95% is in Germany. So basically all this policy, at least in the automotive sector, has benefit just only one country and not any other country in Europe. So I think it is important also to really make it clear what has been the role of the European Union in creating these regional imbalances, and also to create a sort of understanding of left forces that there is a clear need to completely change the way in which the single market is organized. And I guess sectoral analysis, empirical evidence, I think is a good way to start to create some sort of understanding of that. And in working in that, just this for the debate, I thought that a way to go could be to try to reconnect regional markets and industries, which some way goes in the direction you suggest of these pockets of protectionism. And one of the most striking examples, I've always been shocked when I discovered that, is the fact that Eastern European countries have been integrated in Europe as potential new markets, in particular for cars, since they have a rate of equipment that was very low when they integrated the European Union. And so there were forecasts that anticipated for 2020 4 million new vehicles sold in these countries. And the reality today is that we are more or less at the same level we were at the end of the 1990s, which is we roughly sell 1 million, 1.5 million cars in these countries nowadays. And this despite a strong economic growth in this country in the last 15 years. And this is being directly connected with the European regulations. First, on the one hand, we have regulations of the standards of the car. So you create a single market in which the average standardized car is a premium car that needs to have a certain rate of equipments that would make unsellable in countries like, I don't know, Russia or Brazil. You would not have a market for new cars in these countries with European standards. So if you apply these European standards to Central and Eastern European markets, clearly you will not have a market for new cars there. And on the other hand, when these countries have tried to regulate the imports of second-hand markets, and everybody knows that you don't have a new market for new cars without regulating imports of second-hand cars. This is a big problem for Africa, for example, we've been discussing in a previous GERPISA seminar this year. Well, the European Union has stopped, and even in a very violent way through the European Court of Justice, any attempt by these countries to create a market for new cars. So this has transformed these potential new markets in providers of cheap labors. And so these countries export 95% of their productions. And they basically, all the industries being created in these countries is completely disconnected. And you don't have a market for new cars there. So one proposal I would have is, let's try to reconnect these markets and their industry in order also to produce the kind of green cars that could be used and sell in these countries that have become in the meantime the main contributor to the growth of CO2 in Europe. During the last 20 years, their share has gone from 15 to 30% of the total CO2 in the transport sector in Europe. So this is the kind of example that I think could provide some practical avenue to think about this progressive industrial policy. And the last point I would like to make is about the place of GERPISA, because you put GERPISA in your scheme about which different actors can contribute to an industrial policies. And I would say that GERPISA is a kind of a neutral place in the sense that it's been trying to act as a legitimate actor that can speak both to trade unions, but also to government representatives, but also to employers. And I think that is extremely important to take into account the fact that, I don't know if you agree with me with that, but I think there is an important element that a progressive industrial policy requires also employers to agree with that and to be involved with that, which is a very difficult challenge, taking into account also the state of financialization of the employers organization. But I guess to be able to speak with employers and to build kind of agreements on one a progressive industrial policy could be, in particular for employers in Southern European country, in Eastern European countries for some type of sector, or in countries like France, could be in their advantage. And so bringing in employers and not only seen as enemies in the capital labor relation, I think it should be also integrated as a lever of actions to have a kind of dialogue with employers on these perspectives. And for example, Mark Misrushi, who is an author in the economic sociology, is emphasized in the case of the United States of the New Deal was very much the result not only of democratic forces and stronger trade unions, but also the elite of employers who saw the advantage of these more progressive industrial policies for the United States at the time. So I think we need also to find a way to have a dialogue and to bring in employers in this alliance. Otherwise, with the small weight of the left forces, I see very difficult. How do you change the balance of power? So I think that the place of GERPISA is trying to, what we were trying to do is rather to play this kind of role rather than being more like in the left forces. And that's also why the composition of the GPISA network is very heterogeneous. And I think that we will hear different opinion about the feasibility and the desirability of such a progressive industrial policies. So I guess I will stop there, and we're just saying that from this perspective, the CO2 transition, the greening of the industry is of course extremely problematic. Is problematic for the industry, and is problematic for the trade unions, is problematic for the state. And of course, it's something that cannot be avoided. And so I guess this is really the topic for the future for us, how in this particular dimension of the greening, there is room for creating a progressive industrial policy, but there's also room for more imbalances and more uneven development. So I think this is really a crossroad for Europe, and something that is very interesting for us to work on, but also extremely what is strategic and important. I'll stop there. I talk as usual too much. Please feel to react as you want, pick up what you would like to answer. There will be other questions. So I think the best idea is to give back the word to you. You react briefly, and then we have other round of questions. And thank you again very much.
Okay, we will collect a few questions. Julia, I guess I already abused my chairing powers to book myself to ask questions. I see that there are also comments in the chat, so maybe afterwards we can read them. So I have a few points and like between comments and questions. So first of all, thank you very much for your presentation and your paper. I also enjoyed it a lot. I also appreciated, as Tommaso mentioned, your literature choices. It's much literature that I also used for my own work when I wrote or also taught industrial policy in a different context, not European. So my questions and my points are, one is on the definition of industrial policy, where you specify that in between a wide and a narrow view of industrial policy, you expressly embrace the so-called narrow view of industrial policy, so strictly referring to manufacturing. So if you can expand on this, like why exactly? Is this to allow for reflections on what progressive means, but to what extent this makes sense to you? If you can explain more, whereby you refer to a context like the European context, where there has been, if not deindustrialization, but substantive delocalization of manufacturing towards non-European settings. So this is not an automatic choice. So if you can justify that more, I would be happy. Also, how? The other question is referred to this idea of pockets of protectionism and selective delinking. So as a scholar on the Global South, I was particularly excited when you mentioned that you borrow from literature on the Global South. However, I mean, listening, for example, to students that work on industrial policy in the Global South, I find that unfortunately today, although ideologically we could justify it, but this idea of delinking is not exactly what comes out from the Global South today. It was in the literature a la Samir Amin, but is not what today the Global South expresses, whereby the focus is most often on integration in global value chains rather than delinking. So what is the feasibility of this today in a context of global production, not European, and in a context of WTO dominated rules? My fear is that unfortunately, if ever pockets of protectionism and delinking were possible, This would still be possible for the powerful industrial core nodes of the world, not for the rest of the world. So how do we rely this? How do we take into account the global south here that has no choices in this sense? Even if they wanted to protect, they would destroy their productive base. Finally, a question is just if you can expand a bit more, connecting to our own focus on the automotive industry, probably sharing a bit more of this paper that we look forward to reading, that you mentioned, the brochure that we all want to read. So since we don't have access yet, but if you can expand a bit more on what would tackling these cross-cutting issues in the automotive sector mean, especially gender balances, gender relations, and labor and democratic participation. So at best, there is a focus at European level of collaborations among trade unions, but relative, not all trade unions do. And on ecological sustainability, what would this mean on gender and labor, where differentials have already been allowed, as Tommaso was saying, example, the Eastern European industry. Differential in low-cost labor have already been allowed. So what is the scope for collaboration and cooperation in this regard? Thank you very much. I see other ends. Gregor?
Shall I go on? Hi, I'm Grzegorz Lechowski. I'm at the Berlin Social Sciences Center. And actually, I mean, let me start with a few remarks. First of all, thank you for this fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it very, very much. And there are multiple reasons for that. And one of the reasons is that also together with Tommaso here, we are currently working on a research project which touches upon very similar questions to the topics of to the topic in general and specific, some questions that you addressed in your analysis. So we are dealing with industrial policy reactions within the EU and beyond to the COVID crisis, and fascinating perspective that you have developed in your research. So I think it would be good. I mean, we would be definitely interested to interact with you on that. And we are working on a very similar political economic perspective. So I was very interested to hear that. I would have many questions, but since the room for discussion here is limited, I will maybe ask one very specific, which addresses one of the, I would say, minor points, but for us, nevertheless, very interesting points. A point that you addressed in your presentation, which is about the specific modes of implementation of the potentially progressive industrial policies within the EU. And then a sort of observation you shared regarding which I would probably not necessarily agree, and that's why I want to highlight this one. So you said that corporatist, let's say, political economic actors constellations may work in this way, that they may inhibit, if I understand that correctly, that they may inhibit the implementation of potentially progressive industrial policies. To be honest, I had the same kind of hypothesis when we were starting our comparative work on France and Germany within our research project, which is, we are at a very early stage. So I must say I'm kind of like brainstorming here. So I was thinking, and this really went to one of the abstracts that we submitted also together with Tommaso to SASI and to other conferences. So I was writing things like, okay, we had this sort of like close interlocking between the industry and policy actors, for instance, in Germany. In France, it's already different. And the hypothesis was sort of, okay, this sort of interlocking, it may inhibit the change because the actors, the incumbent actors will sort of have influence on the way the industry policy is done, and they will like sort of influence it according to their interests. And so they are incumbents, therefore they will be for sort of like less change and less transformation. In fact, I do not longer think this is true. I do no longer, so we are making some sort of observations, seeing what trade unions, what industrial associations or companies themselves are doing in this constellation of, let's say, 4 kinds of actors: the government, the industry, the companies, including trade unions. And in the German case, this would be sort of like updated version of this hypothesis that we had at the beginning. I would say maybe indeed this sort of corporatists. I mean, corporatists, we need to take it into sort of inverted commas here. So it's sort of like neo-corporatists maybe at best, but this sort of like close collaboration or links between these kinds of actors, they seem to be in the context of the COVID policies in the automotive industry, in fact, work supportively for the technological change. So we are seeing sort of situation that, you know, even trade unions are on the same level on the board with the government, trying to push the industry forward towards more technological change than less. Even the companies, although here we have some sort of division between the potential beneficiaries and the losers of the transformation, they are for more progressive industrial policies than less. Although here I must say some large suppliers and the companies really deeply involved in the old kind of technologies would definitely see themselves as the losing parts and maybe not necessarily support the more progressive line. But then, so let me maybe wrap up this one as a sort of like simple question. So how do you think, like, what role the corporatists, neo-corporatists, I'd say, or post-corporatist political economic constellations may play in Europe, because that was our focus. But of course, other cases would also be interesting, would play in implementing the progressive industrial policies. Thanks.
Yeah, perhaps Yura, you want to already start addressing these many questions that you received,
Yeah, I have a
and
very
then we
long
have another
list,
round. Okay.
Yeah, so let me start. Thank you for all those great questions and comments. There's lots to say about it. I hope I will not talk for an age. I will try to be brief on everything. And I think I can, because I do not disagree basically with most of what you have said. So first, Tommaso, yeah, I think it's right that the revival of industrial policy started under a neoliberal banner. Although I would make the argument that also other currents are present. So there is more state interventionist currents also present in the policy debate, but they have been subordinated for quite a long time. And what Etienne and I wrote in our most recent paper that came out just a few months ago is that there has been a shift in Germany where the liberal fraction lost a bit of their absolute hegemonic power. And now state intervention comes back to some extent that it has not been present before. So that paper that I talked about today was written in 2018. And back then I would totally agree on what you have said. But I feel that there has been a shift in Germany that might link quite well with what is happening in France and with positions that are present in France already for longer. So there might be a shift to some kind of post-neoliberal industrial policy that is in favor of stronger state intervention due to geopolitical conflicts that are on the rise. That's the argument that we make, that this change in the geopolitical constellation on the global level actually led German capital fractions to reconsider whether they might want to allow some kind of sectoral industrial policy under specific conditions, as this European champions debate that I mentioned actually suggests. And I think China is a model. Well, in any case, you cannot copy a development model of a country that has completely different conditions. But it's always worth to study how they did it. And I think they were so successful in catch up and in developing industrial competitiveness in specific sectors and even overtaking Europe, that it's definitely worth to study how they did that. And also to try to draw conclusions and to see what might be established or what could be adopted. So obviously, I think that's still important. And what I think, what is totally right about what you said, I mean, the neoliberal debate needs to be deconstructed, but there was also some kind of gap in the left, I felt. For quite a long time, very few people in the left worked on production. I feel that in many cases, reproduction has become a very important topic, which is really important, but it has somehow removed the debates on production that have been totally dominant for decades, actually. I would say from the 1950s until the 1980s, that was the topic. And then I can just say it from sociology, this has shifted totally, because it was said, well, this is men studying men in manufacturing, so let's study other social groups, which is totally understandable and also very important. But we've lost track somehow on those debates. And this is also why it's so difficult, I feel, to influence now those debates, because there's not that much studies on it. And there's not that much connection also between the older debates and the new ones. And the critical reflection of the history, for example, of state-owned enterprises. That's something that's totally lacking in Austria. It's just a very simplified version of was a bad thing or was a good thing, but nobody's really trying to figure out what would it mean from a progressive stance today to think about increased state ownership. So I totally agree on that. Second, the feasibility, that's actually, I can just continue talking. The progressive actors have now not that much visions because they have just not had so many debates on it. So I think the first point would be to increase thinking about what industrial policy could actually be, and then try to build alliances around that. So I feel that to a certain extent, neoliberal hegemony is eroding. I would argue that. For us, the task in that moment should be to try to build alliances, and not only with the most obvious actors, but also with others. I will show the slide again, because I think I have not mentioned it and jumped over it. So just to mention it again, I have here the employer associations. So I totally agree that you need employers for any kind of progressive transformation of the economy, because they own the enterprises. And it would be just some kind of utopic vision to do it without them in any case. But what I mean here is that you need to have negotiations with them, but also to bear conflicts and to have proper ideas about what kind of transformation you need. So in this brochure, I write about some kind of conflict partnership. So you work with them, you discuss with them, you try to find a compromise with them, but you should have on your own a view of what you want. And today I feel sometimes what is really lacking is that the progressive forces conceive a good industrial policy, how they want to have a good starting point for negotiations. And you need that. And particularly in the countries where social partnership, corporatism is strong, sometimes there is no proper ideological work from beforehand. And you start the debate already with a compromise, and then it's very hard to really push for a progressive direction, I think. I also totally agree that the imbalances in the EU were also promoted by EU regulations and also by decisions taken by EU institutions, I think. So there is definitely an institutional role in this, and also the whole dynamic of European integration and the structure is not really helpful. What do I think? How could you work against it? Well, to stop the rise of the right, I think the answer would be to involve the workers in that kind of transformation that should happen, to not work for them or instead of them, but to give them a say in it, to really let them speak at the enterprise level, but also at other levels, and to establish some kind of democratic involvement. I will come to that a bit later, what that could look like. And also, I totally agree that you would need some kind of stronger domestic orientation of the economies, particularly of the Southern European economies. As you have rightly said, the export sectors, the sectors focused on exports, they actually show features quite similar to economic sectors in the global South. So they're export oriented. People in those countries do not buy those products that much. And this leads to an economic dynamics where the domestic market is quite delinked from the overall dynamics. And so I agree, you would need to have some kind of domestic economic dynamic. This is also what means not to be dependent, because dependency in the most common definition means that some economy, some actors outside of your own economy condition your own development. And if you have a domestic economy oriented towards basically satisfying the needs of your population, you're not in a dependent condition. Yeah, I agree on this. And also, I would just shortly show you that slide again. The actors I have on this side, they're not all on one side for me. So I try to not only put there like progressive actors where I think that they definitely try to be on one side, but also research institutions and projects that try to provide us with the information we need for the transformation. Because you actually cannot have any kind of green transition, social ecological transformation without having lots of data on that, with knowing how a sector works, who is employed there, what are the growth dynamics, what is the structure of the GVCs that dominate in the sector. So that's why I put those there too. So I know that you try to be neutral in those debates, and I think it's good to have this kind of orientation as an academic network, that you're not on one side. Yeah, so that was the first. Then Lorenza, why we decided to focus on manufacturing. This is related to the definitions or the debates in the Global South, that if you export manufactured goods, you are less dependent usually than if you're subordinated in GVCs or if you're exporting raw materials. That's why we chose that definition, saying that it just makes a difference what you produce and how much value added you have in those products. And we had a debate on that, because I know that those industrial policy definitions applied particularly in Europe and the USA most commonly also involve services. But then you already talk about structural change. And our definition was that if Southern Europe wants to become less dependent on the core countries, it needs to reestablish manufacturing. That's why we took the narrow definition. Then on delinking at the Global South, it's true that the debates that are coming to Europe from the Global South do not talk about delinking, but I personally also do research on the Global South mostly. And I can tell you from the interviews I made for my dissertation that there is in Latin America and also in Eastern Europe, people talking about delinking and about how can you restructure GVCs. So there is some critical debate also on GVC insertion and what does this mean for your own economic structure, particularly because if your main strategy is to become part of global value chains, it most likely will link you to transnational companies that have no whatsoever interest in your personal country development. So there is critical reflection on that, but I agree that the international institutions and the most well-known scholars do not transport those debates. But I think that this is it can be an important starting point for shifting also the debate and for coming back to a rich tradition of debates on that question. But I think it's a good point what you said, that pockets of protectionism, might they not serve the powerful actors in the global economy? I would argue those actors already have pockets of protectionism. I mean, they bend the WTO rules whenever they want. And the EU always says it has no kind of protectionist measures. And if you have a closer look, I would find measures that I would call protectionist towards China, for example. The US also applies such kind of measures quite frequently. So it's also a question of power. If I can sell my measures as non-protectionist at the WTO level, I would say. Yeah, the third one, what would that mean for the automotive industry? That's now again a very long answer, I think. Do you want to raise further questions or make comments? Because if not, I will just keep talking for ages. So maybe if someone wants to jump in, I will just leave from here. I have not written down the questions and continue a bit later.
We have another question, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Julia, for this interesting presentation. Since I did a lot research on China, so I will, based on my experience on China, and give you my question. I think that in terms of industrial policy, yes, the Chinese situation is totally completely different from the European situation. You have the fundamental political structure, policy structure, which is complete another system. So at the level of national level, which is for China, and the European level, I don't see anything that Europe can learn from China. Even that you can understand the policy and then try to implement that, but it doesn't work. But for me, I think that's an interesting point that Europe may refer to China is that to watch more closely to the Chinese local governments or regional level experience, which is fascinating. Yes, from outside, we always watch China as one country, one government. But in fact, it is composed by a very complicated hierarchical structure and system of different levels of governments. For example, you have a provincial government, and then under that, you have regional government, prefectural governments, city governments, even district government, town governments, village government. So you have all these government, and each government, local government, they implement. Well, they create, but also they implement the industrial policy or industrial strategy. If you have a national strategy. So for many years, since I observed the Chinese local government's policy, industrial policy practice, is based on a very interesting idea and concept, which is called cluster, industrial cluster. I think it's from the late 1990s, and since the publication of the Porter's famous the national the competitive advantage of nations. Well, the Chinese, it's translating into Chinese. The Chinese governments learned a lot from that book and that idea to say how we develop local industrial clusters. So they elaborate a lot of, and then you have many policy ideas, policy tools, which finally was eventually assimilated and then institutionalized by the central government and then implement at the national level. So I think that's the policy experience of the Chinese local governments may provide maybe something interesting to Europe to refer to or to even to learn to. So my question is very simple. Is I've been living and working also in France, Europe since years. And in the beginning, I even read about some literature on cluster, etc. But less and less, I think that European policymakers or even academic researchers, pay less attention, get less interested in industrial cluster. Well, in France, we know that we have the board de compétitivité since many years, but it doesn't make so much significant impact. Well, my question is very simple. What is the situation right now in terms of industrial policy? What is the status or position of industrial cluster? And whether can you see any future or potential to exploit the framework of industrial cluster, rebuild the industrial cluster to really become the competitive centers for the future for Europe? Thank you.
Anybody else, or Julia can respond to this, can get back to this point?
If there is no other questions, I can just continue with where I left, but I will start here because the other questions I will repeat anyway to give you some kind of flow in the debate. So I actually, when I said we could learn something from China, was thinking exactly about what you said, that the local and regional policies were really interesting and that you should study this and understand or check whether that might work in Europe. But I am personally no expert on China at all. This is why I cannot really say how useful that might be in the end. But I can definitely say that it's worth it not to be totally Eurocentric in industrial policy debates, because the huge industrial policy successes were in East Asia during the past decade. So it's worth to study what they did to end up where they are now. And the debates on cluster, I feel that they lost strength with GVCs somehow. When the global value chains became stronger, industrial cluster debates became less. I feel, at least I do not read a lot on industrial clusters, and I know that in all the debates they have been mentioned quite a lot. And I feel this also might be because industrial clusters play a specific role, right? Like they could play a good role in global value chains if they are specializing on research and development in a specific field and are inserted in a chain, and might provide that kind of linkages, forward and backward linkages that are useful in that context. But I feel that cluster policy also in the EU is taking place a lot at the regional or local level. So this is why the EU doesn't really tackle it. Maybe in the smart specialization strategy by promoting that kind of policies. But I think for answering that question, you would need to talk about specific countries and probably about specific regions in specific countries. So I know that in Austria, there's cluster policies in some places around some specific topics, but I could not give you a general answer for the EU. I just can tell you that in the EU documents I'm reading, clusters do not play a huge role, but maybe that is the case in the smart specialization strategy, on which I am not focused that much. So maybe in that one, they play a bigger role. And maybe someone else wants to answer on that because he or she knows more than I do about that specific topic. I will just continue shortly by answering the question, what would it mean in the automotive industry to focus on gender relations, democratic inclusion, trade unions, and the social ecological transformation? To focus on gender relations, or to have that in mind, would mean to have a check. What does it mean to change now to electromobility? What kind of shifts does this produce in the productive structure, but also in the extraction of raw materials that you need for that shift, and also in the shift of energy resources that you need for that kind of transformation. So not only to focus on the enterprises that produce cars, but also to focus on the resources that you need for really implementing that shift. And there to do a gender assessment, to just have a look what kind of changes will happen if I buy different kinds of raw materials, and might this have detrimental consequences for women in any of the involved countries. Regarding democratic inclusion, I will show you the second slide that I jumped over when I did my presentation, because I think now it fits a bit better. So in that brochure that I talked about, I made this kind of this picture saying what else is to be done. And there I argue that you have to have at company level and at plant level very specific policies where you include the workers. I think what they did in Germany with the transformation map is quite a good thing. So that was something that IG Metall, the German production trade union, used to make surveys in different companies where they had access because they had members there, to ask them about the challenges of the digital transformation. And I think actually you could do a second round asking about the challenges of the social ecological transformation, and also about ideas about possible shifts of production patterns of conversion, talking to the workers themselves, also to give them the idea that not someone else totally disconnected from them decides on their futures, but to really involve them. And also this proposal has been raised, the transformation short time work allowance should be introduced so that workers get paid temporarily by the state, but then they can be retrained in order to fit better to the new circumstances. So that might be a good thing. And what I also think where democratic inclusion is important is talking about the development of sector-wide industrial action plans, what I have here. So I think if we talk about the transformation of a specific sector, it would be good to have an idea for the whole sector in the EU, what this transformation should look like and how it could happen. And that would be a classical field where social partnership or neo-corporatism could play a role, but where I think that also the workers directly should be involved. And also here, for example, in transformation funds, in what kind of project are funded by transformation funds, it would be feasible to also fund projects where workers get involved in that kind of transformation. So I think this is open to debate, and it's still very vague what I'm saying, I know, but I feel there is moments and possibilities to give the workers a say, and that they should be used. I also need to say that I personally am not at all against social partnership, neo-corporatism. I think it's good to have any kind of relationship, to be able to talk and also to have some mediated way of talking about conflicting interests. So that's not what I wanted to say, that I think this is not helpful at all. What I meant by it might inhibit the implementation of progressive industrial policy is because there are two different interests at labor and capital side that might come together and then inhibit progressive industrial policy. That is, as a trade union, I want to preserve jobs. As a company, I want that things remain as they are because I do not want to lose capital that I have already invested. And if for those different reasons, I want everything to stay the same, it will be difficult to have any kind of transformation policy. And in Austria, we observe this very frequently, that particularly the industrial associations are totally against any kind of sustainable transformation policies because they say it's costly and we want to recover from COVID-19 before we do anything else. And as trade unions, you're not jumping in then and saying, but we want to change now. And we don't care whether our workers lose their jobs. Let's do it now. So you get some kind of dynamics that might be blocking the transition because of this. That's what I wanted to say about that. But I think to have any kind of transformation, you will need to build on those corporatist policies. Yeah, so I will leave it here, and I'm curious to hear any other comments or thoughts by you.
Yes, I don't know if that is an old raised end or a new one.
That would be a very short
okay,
let's
please go.
that. I mean, thanks for your reactions to this, let's say, corporatism. Let's put it in inverted commas, the complex concept. So, but to this question, I would expect theoretically the same kind of tensions that you have just mentioned, Julia. Eder. At the same time, yesterday I was reading transcription from an interview with IG Metall, and they were saying clearly, we are putting transformation clearly on our agenda. and everything. I mean, we are pushing. That's a sort of you know, I think it leads us somewhere beyond the established conception of or understanding of what the interlocking interests in the corporatist systems might be. They are saying like, we see, I mean, maybe the question here is not that generally about the characteristics of corporatist political economies, but maybe about German political economy very specifically, and you know how well prepared trade unions may be to deal with questions of technological change, etc. But they are saying, you know, we are not pulling the brake here. We are sort of accelerating, and we are also thinking then what to do about, you know, the suppliers that are clearly disadvantaged by that, etc., etc. But they are saying clearly on the high level of our political agenda as the trade union, IG Metall, we are saying, you know, we are with together. We are making the progression. We are making and supporting the transition. So there is still much work empirically for us to do here, other interviews, and maybe differentiating the view in terms of, you know, trade unions in Germany. There are complex beings, so to say. There's central line, there's regional line, etc., etc. So there might be differences here. But I'm just, you know, this is a surprising thing, and I would say what you were saying up to now was sort of like what we were expecting to be, and the theory seems to indicate that maybe more dynamics is already there. So this is my reaction just to that. Thank you for your response.
I don't know if there is anybody else who wants to.
I will have some other questions, but I just stop a second to see if there anybody else who has not asked question yet who wants to step in.
Maybe just before people leave, if someone is leaving, I just want to repeat, I shared the paper, the 2018 paper that Julia sent us also here in the chat, but it is on the GERPISA website. Julia, if you want to send us also the other publications you spoke about, the 2021 article and the brochure you mentioned, we can also upload those on our website. Thomas.
Okay, so I think there are 3 points that one that I haven't talked during the discussion, which is this concept of transnational solidarity, which is a very old concept in Europe that's been around in the trade union movement since the 1970s and 80s and the early stage of European integration. It's very interesting to go back to that time, because already at the time people were looking at the project of the single market about the risk of social and economic dumping, which means that the trade unions were all aware of whatever was coming, and yet they failed completely to address these issues. I think that also with historians, there's now that Sigfrido Ramirez is here, there is this issue of why the trade unions, which were very powerful, for example, in the automotive sector, extremely powerful in the 1970s and 80s, and have been involved in the process of creating the European Union, and in particular the common market and the single market, have failed to be able to integrate in the European project a more progressive institutional tools that would have protect countries, workers, sectors from these that we see nowadays. I mean, this systematic economic and social dumping in which each country is put in competition one with each other. So I think that we should look at the future, but there are things also that why these left forces that were much more powerful than they are today in the 80s have failed to be able to build a Europe in which these more industrial progressive policies would have had a greater role. And concerning transnational solidarity, I think this is extremely difficult to build nowadays. And this is a problem in the sense that it is even difficult to build at the national level, because the industry is very much fragmented. The value chains, first of all, there's been a huge fragmentation of the sector between global OEMs, global suppliers, and then first and second, third, even fourth tiers and different sectors, all process of externalization, offshoring, which makes extremely difficult even for the trade unions to identify which are the population concerned. How do you reach to them? How do you realize that they are on the same boat? It's extremely difficult. And then within the company, this in France is very clear. You have this old workforce that is phasing out, but through pensions, early retirements. They're not fired. You know, they're just slowly building down, dismantling. You know, some parts of the industry keep the high value added part of that, keep the old workers happy more or less. And then you have these huge mass of temporary agency workers, which represent an increase in share. They are those who bear the fluctuations of whatever the market. So when the market goes down now, well, the thousand and thousand temporary workers are laid off. Then you have also the state, which helps. So that means that the workers that are getting out, that were in the old regime, they're not very much concerned about. They're not in problems. So when you reach out them for transnational solidarity, they don't listen to you. I mean, and the trade unions still work for them to a certain degree, because there are those who are unionized, there are that they know them. So there is this problem of polarization. And then when you move out to Central and Eastern European countries where work protection is very weak, these people can be fired from a day to another with no issue. So this problem of, you know, this concept that has been around as a sort of natural thing, where, you know, we are workers, international trade unions, transnational solidarity, this needs to be built again from scratch, and it's not there, and you cannot rely on that. And for example, we have done a seminar, one of these monthly seminars on Uber, and we get example of incredible, very quick developing of transnational solidarity between Uber drivers or delivery bikers, all through Europe, so even worldwide. And that is interesting, because in theory, these are people that, as our speaker said, you would not expect to get organized. You know, they're very at the margins of society, that they don't work even for a company, they're not even recognized as workers, but they share the same conditions. So it's relatively easy for them, you know, because they have this awareness of sharing the same conditions. So having to deal with the same algorithm to build this solidarity and connect to one another. So I think there is a work to be done to get back to all these workers all through the value chains, and try to provide the empirical evidence that they belong to the same industry, and there's a European industry, and corporate powers are very well aware of that, and workers and trade unions much less so. So I think this is a point that really needs some heavy work from trade unions, from researchers. Second point, I was thinking about the comparison of China and Europe. It's impossible to do whatever. But what is interesting is that in China, my feeling, I'm not an expert, is that you have a sort of complete government, and I will explain what I mean by that, at each level, which means that you have government that can create, for example, this pocket of protections at regional city levels, and they have the power to do so, and they control all the dimensions, more or less. Well, there are some sort of control from the Communist Party at the national level, but they have the Communist Party at each level, at each government which is present. So you have these each regional government has really strong competences. Now, the paradox of the European configuration, in which basically you don't have anywhere at each level a complete government, because the European Union has a lot of prerogatives that concern trade, competitions, some regulation for the car industry for concerning CO2 or the norms of pollution for engines, homologations, and these cannot be touched on national levels. But the European Union has no competence over employment, fiscal policies, and other policies. So you have a kind of disconnected governments, and that makes it extremely difficult to implement industrial policies, because the industrial policies are sort of kind of fragmented between the European level and the national level. And so you have sort of compensatory you have rules at the European level which are struggle or readjust at the national level, and that different regions react. And this is a big handicap of the European Union, actually, is that you don't have a complete government anywhere. So it's sort of paradox is what you were talking about. What we do, we go for more Europe, because we create a complete government which at least can deal with employment and fiscal and all this social and economic dumping, because they have the prerogatives to deal with that, or we go back to more national. in which at least the nation takes back some control over their trade, over their currency, over their market. And actually we are stuck between the two. And this is a huge problem for industrial policy. And the last point about this debate about the corporatist change in Germany towards more like progressive industrial policy, with the state steps in to play a stronger role in towards electromobility. I guess that we will see, unfortunately, or I don't know, this fracture in the left view on that. And this is the fracture between what we were talking about, actually it was in the presentation about the green growth. So the idea that we can have a left-wing green growth with a strong state that promote electrification as the solutions, and we save the industries and we save the world through technology. And this needs the state to step in, because we know that electrification companies cannot do alone. They need subsidized for the electric infrastructure. They need subsidized to sell the cars. They need the state at every level to sell electric cars. And they need to do, because at the European level, due to the Dieselgate, because without the Dieselgate, we wouldn't be here. That's another point. Without the Dieselgate, we wouldn't be here at all. So they need to do that. So they need to comply with regulation that, due to the current state of affairs, they have no choice. So one can say this is a left opportunity for the state to step in and to have more electric cars or whatever. But there is another kind of left view, more radical, that says this is a trap, because actually we are just electrifying a system that is unsustainable in the long run. We should have less car. We should have cars that are shared. We should have smaller cars. We should get the cars out of the control of these corporate powers. We should rethink the whole energy transport setting, the whole economic setting, and not having these progressive policies which actually fix capitalism, but rather really raise the problems. And I guess that, yeah, you can see that corporate assets are shifting, but well, they have to after the Dieselgate, and basically, well, the IG Metall, what IG Metall says is what Volkswagen is saying. So I don't see that. And Volkswagen is exactly the same. I want full electrification. I want battery electric vehicles. I'm turning the page. So is problematic. And at the same time, if you look at like the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation or whatever, they would say, well, this is the wrong way, because we need to rethink the whole system. And the very difficult future for me is how these different views on the left can convert to something that would make sense and result in a real progressive industrial policy, which is both realistic, which is, it can actually be implemented with large political lines, but doesn't fall into capture from usual capitalist kind of trajectory. So I think we are talking about something that is extremely problematic. And I really welcome this conversation that we have, because it helps all of us to kind of have this kind of setting of, wow, we need to deal with that, which is extremely difficult. So that would be my 3 kind of comments for all the participants to debate about.
We have Sigfrido that wanted to intervene. Can we collect this and then we allow Julia to respond? Sorry, Julia. I keep saying Julia. I'm sorry. Sigfrido, are you there?
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for the camera also. Yeah, thank you very much for this stimulating paper. However, I think that there are some issues that I would like maybe that you deepen or give your opinion, which I understand is the opinion of somebody who is specialized in the Global South and is trying to enlarge the debate on industrial policy to the European Union, which is a very specific construction, and it can be seen in the way you present your map of stakeholders. It was very striking for a specialist on the EU, like myself, that there were not any institution presented, of course, the particularity of the European Union, that there are political institutions where all these alliance debates between progressive forces can take place. For example, the place where productive regions discussed is the Committee of the Regions. And of course, the importance of regional policy for European policies was supposed to be, when the Single European Act was launched, the counterbalance of the dismantling of internal barriers, which, by the way, I would like to remind that is not only a neoliberal content, no? The idea of standardizing and creating European standards, harmonization of standards, was a way of creating neo-protectionist element at European level, eliminating the national technical barriers, no, to trade. And there was, of course, an impact, an economic impact on reducing this diversity of technological rules, no, of technical rules. So this important regional policies what explain that, for example, in Spain, the automotive industry is maintained. You know, the reason why it is maintained is precisely because if the policy at the national level is very weak, when you go at the regional level, it's obvious that Catalonia, or it's obvious that the Basque Country, and I'm sure you know very well, the Basque Country is a model, is the model of what could be a neo-corporatist regional policy, no? Not only in the automobile, but also in other sectors with the cooperative sector, Mondragon model, you know, all these things which still exist actually, you know, and also try to combine also a training of workers, no, affected by restructuring, no, and well, there is a whole literature on that, which maybe you are not so much aware because, of course, it's a particular case, no. But I wanted to mention this issue because I think it was very important related to that paradigm that was evoked by our Chinese colleague, which is the paradigm of the regional cluster, which, by the way, I would like to remind that was also one of the features of the contribution of the Italian industrial model, no? Was cluster, was Emilia-Romagna, and actually in most of the policymakers in Spain who were in charge of industrial policies, this was the element. National policies are difficult because what Tommaso mentioned of competition limits on state aids, but regional aids were allowed. Regional aids where there was a budget, a European budget, which was allocated, insufficient European budget. So that is the other element which maybe was that I wanted to mention. The other point is more what is your opinion, because there is already a progressive paradigm of industrial policy, or maybe which is this Matsukato paradigm, no, the mission-oriented innovation policy, because as you know, most industrial policy became innovation policy. No, there was the focus. The focus not was really on structure, but was more on the innovation policies. In most countries, Ministry of Industry became Ministry of Research and Innovation. No, so it's innovation what is the core of the debate still today, and the mission-oriented innovation policy. So, what is your opinion on that paradigm, no? Which is inspired more also from the US, from the history of the US industrial policy, which is, and I agree with you, is very curious that we are forgetting the history of state-owned enterprise in Europe, or what was the core of the industrial policy model in Europe until the 80s, basically. No? So that's what is most the question. The other point is that maybe you were mentioning the question of decoupling. I think that this is that makes a lot of sense, maybe, or even if I follow Lorenza, maybe it makes now less sense also in the global south. But the European Union level, I don't see any country seriously, or any government. I mean, people can talk about everything, of course, after Brexit in particular, but I don't see any government, even in Spain, where we have the most progressive government you can imagine in Europe. For now, we cannot, I mean, nobody's talking about decoupling, particularly with the COVID crisis, no? When for the first time there is maybe with this new program, which has to be, which is a new common investments, no? What you were saying that maybe it's going to happen, and apparently all the establishment agrees with that, because it's what they are saying that they are going to do. No, the major countries who will receive more help or more of these common investments is going to be Spain, Italy first, and then Spain, and other countries. So that's the other element. Reality seems to be catching up with our long debates within progressive or left-wing forces. No, I used to be involved with Transform 10 years ago, when there was this debate on industrial policy. We call it productive reconstruction, because it was precisely coming or looking at what would be the alternatives for a Greek left-wing government, which actually took place, no, with the arrival of Syriza, but in very particular circumstances. I'm not aware that there has been a balance of what was Syriza managed to do. But as I see that Manuela was around, maybe I would recommend that you invite some of our Greek colleagues who were involved in the Greek government for 4 years, trying to develop this productive transformation. Some of them were at a very important level in the Greek government. And there were various reasons to talk about that. It was not only about manufacturing, it was of course about a diversity of sectors of the economy that has to be developed. Tourism was one, but also agriculture. Agriculture is a very important sector in these southern economies, and it's not a sector which has non-importance, I would say, even in terms of innovation. No? So that's the other point I wanted to maybe to point out, and then to finish. In general, in the debates we have with the Rosa Luxemburg, when I've been invited to contribute, I think that it's very important that we discuss among progressive forces about what are our points. I mean, like now you are kindly presenting what are some of your ideas, but I think also that we have to confront with the reality of what is going on nowadays. And reality in the European Union is with legislations. The reform of competition policy is on the table. Everybody is seeing that. We cannot, it's impossible to continue in the same line that the competition policy have worked until now with the COVID crisis, with a lot of exceptions that at some point are going to put on the table. So I think that it would be good at some point that there is a forum. I think Manuela was involved maybe with this caucus, no? Left caucus was an attempt at the European Parliament to create such a debate among progressive forces on what would be desirable, but also with some precise debate on regulations and norms at the European level that are on the table, because otherwise, if we have to find an agreement between left-wing forces, I'm afraid, knowing the difficulty, which I think also Tommaso pointed out, for trade unions. I don't want to mention about left-wing parties, no, the diversity between them, between Nordic Green parties, between Portuguese Communist Party, or I don't know, Moravia. So the diversity is too strong in a way. So maybe having this kind of hybrid forum between academics, trade union organizations, members of European Parliament, of different groups, that's a starting point, maybe also to confront with concrete issues that are now being urgently put on the table. Sorry, I've been very long.
No, it's okay. If there are no other questions, I think we will give Julia the opportunity to respond, and then I suppose we will conclude, because there are many points that were raised to cover some time, I guess. But so, yeah, please, Julia.
Yeah, thank you for all the interesting questions and comments. First, I wanted to still make a further comment on Gregor's comment on IG Metall and Germany and the special situation. Yes, I would agree that in Germany there has been some kind of shift, and that there the trade unions, but also the employer associations are more in favor of the transformation now than 5 years ago. It's a shift that I do not witness in Austria, and I spoke before about Austria, but I agree that in Germany you can see the shift. But from a left-wing perspective, there's some other thing linked to this question, and that is who will pay for the transformation. And I feel that currently the shift is related also to the question that it might be able to make the state, the taxpayers, pay part of the transformation, and that therefore there is more interest in the transformation than there was 5 years ago. So this is why I feel that this shift has taken place. It has not happened in Austria yet, in my opinion, but in Germany it has, but linked to this question, who will pay for it? The second thing is, I read Lorenzo's comment on the ISI, and that import substitution might be a strategy where you already need to have some strengths. And I totally agree that to have some economic level ready is important, because if not, you will not be able to have that kind of import substitution. I agree on this. And I also wanted to make clear that I was always talking about selective delinking in very few sectors and temporarily. So I never talked about decoupling, as Sigfrido mentioned it now, but I would really say in a very restricted manner and focus to those sectors that Southern European countries would want to develop. And I'm aware that this is currently no issue raised by those governments themselves. And I would say, yeah, but this is like, this is not my task. As a researcher, I think I can open up policy options. I can maybe bring in things that have been forgotten, that have been raised in history. But if all the governments think that this is not a good idea, that's okay. You know, that's not my. I'm not pissed if people say that's no option. I just try to think about solutions that might be available and that might not be on the table yet. And that's why we raised that issue. And particularly that's related to what Tommaso said, why has transnational solidarity failed? Well, in this moment, European integration took place in the 1980s, 90s, when neoliberalism was on the rise on the one hand. So you had liberalization and deregulation as some measures, some reforms that were really affecting negatively any kind of transnational solidarity, because if there's no regulation, you can take advantage of different labor standards, of different environmental standards in a way that it was not possible before that. And on the other hand, you had globalization with all those offshoring possibilities. So it just became totally different. And now I feel we have a bit of a different context, because neoliberalism is not on the rise as it was back then. It's still there, but now there is forces challenging neoliberalism. So this might allow for different options than we had earlier on, in my opinion. That's why I feel that it might be worth to raise those issues again and to update somehow the debates that we had at an earlier stage. Then also this question on electromobility and the division in the left. Tommaso, I totally agree. I think that there's now different visions on how this social ecological transformation or green transition should take place. You already can see that by the terms that are used. And I also feel that in the left, the question is now, is this strong state good? Or do we maybe need some more radical proposal? And I think that actually the clue how you could get those two different currents in the left together is around this question of who benefits. So to raise the question, how do we distribute the profits? Who gets what out of this kind of transition? Because then you should have some kind of alliance between left-wing people saying that it should not only benefit big transnational companies, but that it should benefit the broader society. And the other question then becomes more a question of strategy, then this crucial question, what can happen? So this is also how I try to tackle that question. Transformation, good. Transition, okay. But who will pay for it and who gets the benefit, and will this be distributed in an equal way? That's the really crucial question around all those issues. And this leads me also to mission-oriented industrial policy and Mazzucato, what Sigfrido raised. I think there are lots of strengths around those mission-oriented industrial policy, one being that Mazzucato clearly raises the necessity to have some industrial strategy, some broader vision that is not only focused on a very small field, but that really tries to develop some kind of idea, where do we want to move to as a society? And I think that's important for industrial policy. And that's what I like about it. I also think it's good to raise this issue about state intervention. But from my personal view, there's still lots of trust in private companies, in private economic actors as being the best actors in the economy. And the state's role basically is to provide that kind of finance for risky investments. And from my personal view, I think that the state could also play a more proactive role, really developing sectors that we might need to develop. Obviously, that's something that is up to debate, and you can totally disagree on this, but I think that's where I would deviate from that position and say we could also think about new models of state ownership, or maybe even only state shares going into economies into companies in order to shape the company strategy into a more ecological direction. That's things that you could debate and that are not present in that mission-oriented policy as far as I know it. And lastly, I wanted to say, yes, I'm specialized in the Global South, but I'm also doing quite a lot of research on regional integration and also on the European Union, touching that somehow. And Etienne Schneider, he's only focused on the European integration process. So we do not both come from this Global South perspective and then did the research on the EU, but Etienne is working only on the European Union. And I also know the debates that you have mentioned about Mondragon and about Emilia-Romagna. But I think there's a very crucial factor that you should mention when you mention particularly those regions as good examples. I mean, they were both developing under protectionist conditions when the countries were still under not open economies, actually. And that's one of the reasons why Mondragon became so strong, because it was actually protected in the Franco Spain. And this should not relativize what they are today, because I think they are great in what they achieved, in how they work, and also how they involve the workers. That's a good thing. But they, as clusters, both regions developed under totally different conditions than the single market as it is today. And this is also why our reform of the single market, this is where that comes from, because actually you do not have that leeway nowadays if you want to set up that kind of policies. That's that's actually what motivated us to raise that issue. You can still argue that's totally unrealistic or not the best way to proceed, but that's where it comes from our point of view. And on the actors that might be missing on my figure, I think many actors are probably missing. So I did not make this figure saying that's complete and that's how it should be. This figure is actually an attempt to say who might be involved in the conception of progressive industrial policy. And I'm totally open for any suggestions who should also be involved, who might be added up to that. So it's not a finished figure. It's actually a first idea. And I hope also that this brochure will trigger debate and will actually raise lots of questions and maybe also intense debates. So thank you for adding that. And I hope this continues that way.
I would just wanted to add a little bit of polemic with Sigfrido about the decoupling. Is the fact that yes, governments, they're not thinking about that, and the British government definitely was not thinking about Brexit either. But if today you make a referendum in the EU 28 countries and you ask them, you want to stay in or out, I'm not sure, you know, under the 28, how much winners you will have with the win, including France. Because it's not clear at all. If you look at the vote on the referendum on the EU in France, nobody would expect it to be lost. It got lost. So it's not, I mean, if you don't think about the coupling, actually, well, the government don't, but the people might eventually get it when the populist parties will manage to ask this stupid question to them, because they don't think that the full decoupling is at all a solution. But if you don't figure out a way to allow South and Eastern European countries to get out of this grip, imperial grip. The global value chain literature provides very stunning value-added geography of Europe. For auto industry is very clear, which you do not see only production, because if you look at production, you say, okay, yes, well, there's been some rebalances, but still France has some, Italy has some, and Eastern European countries are capturing more and more volume. So, you know, there are issues, but if you look at value added, it's just, you know, it's just an empire, you know, you just have a huge, like a circle of value added in Germany and in the nearby. And then you just reduce that. And clearly this is an issue because as Pavlinek, who's an expert of Eastern European countries, has said many times, is that, yes, it looks like we have a, you know, look like Slovakia is the per capita is the strongest automotive industry worldwide. You don't have so much production of vehicle anywhere else in the world as in Slovakia per capita. But you say the government gets nothing out of that. In terms of value capture, is very weak. It's really dependent capitalism. And it's been working on that, you know, really a lot to show out that. So I think that this question of decoupling, you're right about that. If you ask governments, nobody's thinking about that. Is daring to raise the issue. But I think that you're right about raising the issue. I mean, it is a problem that you don't have the room for countering this kind of dynamics. So this is my final polemic remark on that. I'm sorry, we'll have the final word because it's almost 5 o'clock. And so I just wanted to thank everybody for this great conversation. Anyway, with Sigfrido, we'll have time to debate on that much longer. So we'll live in the same seat in Brussels, so that's easy. We'll finally find some time to meet. And I guess we'll all have chances to meet again in other arena or in your PISA International Colloquium or just PISA Monthly Seminar. I think this discussion that is going to be raised all over again. And it's just very good that we are really taking this issue seriously. And so I'm looking forward to future debate. And thanks again, Julia. So I leave the final word to Lorenza and to close the session. I don't know if Julia, you want to have a final word or, okay.
No, we thank you very much, Julia, also for all the dedication in answering the 1,000 questions you received. Thank you very much. Again, if we are happy to be in touch with you, and if you have other publications that you want to share, please send them to us. If you want to attend our colloquium, you find information on the website. And for all the others, I just posted here, just pasted the link to our next seminar, which is on the 21st of May, 9:30, right? Yes, the information's yeah. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending, for staying until the last minute, as usual. We use all the available time. Yeah, stay connected to the network also through our social channels. Where there we post the same information events on all channels. Thank you very much. See you at the next seminar. Bye-bye.